Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good day. This is PwC here with a practical guide to impact tolerances. My name is Simon Chard. I'm a partner in financial services here at PwC. I'm joined by Stella Nunn.
Good afternoon.
And by Adam Stage.
Good afternoon.
The objectives of the webinar. So we are aiming to have a discussion with you around impact tolerances this afternoon. It's a topic that is getting a huge amount of focus in the world of operational resilience. And it's also a topic where there is some interesting divergence of opinion and thinking that we would like to discuss with you today. So please do raise questions through the question feature on the webinar, and we will seek to answer those as we go through the next 40-45 minutes with you. So our objectives are to summarise the thinking on impact tolerances, and our suggestion is that they are thought of as the standards of operational resilience, and we'll bring that to life with some examples for you. We will also outline our methodology for setting and testing impact tolerances with an example that we've worked through for a number of months and spoken to a wide range of clients and regulators about. And importantly, given the audience, we're going to discuss the potential role of the second line of defence in relation to impact tolerances. But first, to recap on operational resilience. Operational resilience is an outcome. It's not a function, a capability, a team. It is an outcome. And that's easy to say, but sometimes gets forgotten as people start out on their operational resilience journey. The key piece here is that this is not disaster recovery or business continuity planning. I think as second line practitioners, it's a really helpful warning signal if you hear people in your organisation say, well, this is just business continuity planning done well, or this is business continuity planning version 2. They are phrases that over the years we have heard many, many times, and quite often it's taken a number of years, and some people have been focused on this topic now for 6 or 7 years, for people to realise that it's not business continuity planning done well. Business continuity planning done well is a very important part of operational resilience. The third suggestion here is particularly relevant for risk management professionals also, which is the reality of a failure is what needs to be focused on, not the ability of a firm to put in place risk management procedures to avoid failure. And there is some interesting debate in the industry at the moment about the focus of operational resilience on failure, and the fact that there is a view that some people feel that some more focus should be given to preventative measures. Personally, I think we've spent a decade or more, maybe approaching 2 decades, with the development of operational risk as a really sound methodology to avoid failures. But the big failures that we've seen in the industries, in the financial industries and more broadly, have been the fact that vulnerabilities have been exposed that people thought were perfectly well risk managed, or a number of vulnerabilities have come together. So assume failure and failure is inevitable are two phrases that you will hear frequently. Our experience also is that is an important message for your boards, both your executive boards and your non-executive boards. And the final point is to always remember that this is about continuity of service to your customers, clients, counterparties, not to your shareholders. There is a lot of material on operational resilience, quite a lot of it provided by PwC, and I hope you enjoy reading it. We are not going to recap on all of the material on operational resilience. And we're increasingly hearing senior client stakeholders within firms saying, yeah, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of industry around operational resilience, and how much of it is really, really important, and what do I need to focus on? And we always talk to these three things, that it's about prioritising what's important to you, understanding the things that really, really matter. It's about setting clear standards, and that's where impact tolerances come in. And then it's about investing to build resilience. And if you only do those three things, then you will have made a considerable progress in terms of operational resilience. There was a UK regulatory meeting on the 14th of February, and that was reinforced by both the Bank of England and by the FCA, that it's about understanding what's important to you and to your customers, your counterparties and your clients. It's about setting appropriate standards, and then it's about investing. And I think a really important test at the moment is when you look at the investment decisions that are being made by your firms, can you see resilience being considered? Can you see resilience for your customers, clients and counterparties being considered in investment decisions?
Can I add something, Simon? So,
yeah.
I think we chose the title for today's webinar really to capture attention. So you add in words like impact tolerance, and suddenly everyone gets excited about it. But what's really helpful, I think, about the messages, Simon, that you've talked through, those three clear things, is it becomes really easy for people to get lost in concepts like business services, mapping, impact tolerances, and to forget the big picture. Now, I wasn't there on the 14th, but absolutely the feedback I've heard is that when you have senior regulators talking about this topic, they want people to focus on that story, finding what's important, setting the standards and investing to build resilience. So impact tolerances are important, and the next 20 odd slides will reinforce that message. But don't get lost in thinking, look, if you can come up with, in inverted commas, the perfect impact tolerance, that you've solved the issue of operational resilience. That wouldn't be the case.
I think a good an analogy we hear is that it's not about the answer to the maths question, it's about demonstrating your workings, which is slightly cliched, but I think very appropriate in this situation. I think the other thing, and we will focus on impact tolerances, the other thing I would add is there is a great deal of focus on what the regulators are asking for. There's perhaps what you might call some noise around how well aligned regulators are globally and how much guidance they're publishing, etc. Our firm view remains that doing this is a matter of competitive advantage and of fitness for doing business, and should be something that firms should be embracing and not just looking at it as a regulatory exercise. We thought we'd take the biggest question sort of head on, and we'll come back to this as we go through the detail as well. One of the issues one of the questions that we often hear is that how do people reconcile the difference between impact tolerance and risk appetite? So we make these observations. Per my earlier points, the risk has crystallised in terms of thinking about operational resilience, recovery and impact tolerance. So the likelihood is certain. When firms set risk appetite, they take into account a number of different items, but they are related to the choices that a firm makes and the firm's specific objectives and the risk that the firm will seek to take to meet its own objectives. Impact tolerances are a measure that should be seen outside in from the regulator, and they are really also a mechanism so that regulators can understand what firms can and cannot tolerate. Not what they choose to accept, but what in an extreme situation or a difficult situation the firm can or cannot tolerate. And one example I was given recently in a conversation with clients and the regulators was, it's at this point where in a problem, in a crisis, in a situation, having discussed impact tolerances ahead of time with the regulator, you have a better conversation with the regulator at time of stress, which says, now we understand you need to talk to us because you are at risk of breaching these tolerances. And impact tolerances are not a single metric or measure. There is not a single measure. They are groups of measures and metrics that come together to describe your impact tolerance. It is much more a qualitative exercise than a quantitative exercise. And one of the things that continues to surprise us as we work with clients is the overwhelming desire for people to look to quantitative metrics rather than to understand the impacts of certain scenarios and how they are managed by the firm. And finally, we've stolen some words from that meeting back on February the 14th, when it was summarised well by Lyndon Nelson of the Bank of England at the end, which said that to be able to explain your impact tolerance to your board or to others, you need to be both a scientist and a poet. So the consultation papers that have been issued by the UK regulatory bodies do cover much of this, so we won't go through or reiterate what they say. They are, of course, essential reading for firms and particularly for risk management professionals. We expect some further guidance from the Basel Committee later this month, but we don't expect a huge amount of divergence from a global regulatory perspective. The impact tolerances are to be used to plan and to discover how your important business services operate. They are relevant to those important business services or critical business services, depending on how you define them. They should be set annually, and there should be specific metrics within the basket of measures that we've talked about for maximal tolerable level of disruption. They should relate to a single disruption. And different regulators will expect them to be different, and that really is reflective of the different objectives that the UK regulators have from a PRA and FCA perspective. And again, we don't expect that to be dramatically different in different jurisdictions. So I'll hand over to Stella, who's going to talk us through some of the work that we've been doing around impact tolerances.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to try and introduce a concept that we've been working on for some time at PwC, and have tried to really, on listening to our clients, really think about how we can distill what is turning into a bit of a science across the sector into something far more practical, sensible, and proportionate again in terms of the steps that you need to take. Apologies, I think the slides have jumped. I'm just going to pause just momentarily while we make sure that you are seeing the correct slide. Thank you. So, in terms of looking at developing those impact tolerances, there are several steps to go through. And even though some of them may not be quite as sequential as we lay out, this is a logical step-by-step view that if you are following it, should get you to an answer that is, again, showing you're working in that sense, not just coming out at the end with an impact tolerance. So quite importantly in this is the identifying and mapping of services. This is the prerequisite of impact tolerances. There is little point jumping to the answer of impact tolerance without knowing what your business services are, and of those which are the important ones. So that is something that we are seeing across the market, that people are in the process of identifying and mapping those services. It's important again in the mapping to consider how those services are delivered through the normal, in inverted commas, enablers or dependencies, which are your people and process, your technology, your suppliers, your physical premises, but also now data and information that's been added into the mix far more explicitly than it was before. So by following the next steps, which really is a logical flow of you have your mapped business service, how does that operate on a normal everyday basis? So the business intelligence part of this really comes to the fore as opposed to just a traditional BC or DR look at what happens. This is an everyday intelligence around the service. How does it function? What are the flows? What transactional volumes and values run through that service? What are the number of customers that run through that service? What type of customer is using that service? And that is something that your organisation will know, but you're going to gather it for a slightly different purpose. Once you have that baseline view, then it is the point at which you are starting to think about how would that service be disrupted? How will you assess the impact on the users of that service? What are the outcomes that they are expecting from that service that may not occur in disruption? And there you can start to assign impact tolerances. And again, that grouping of metrics that will allow you to measure the level of disruption and what is tolerable and not tolerable. And to do that, once you have those set, is to run the stress test. So a tabletop exercise, using all that baseline data, using the information you have on impact tolerances, to assess whether that service would be able to stay within tolerance or breach tolerance in certain scenarios. And you should run several different scenarios to see, are there certain scenarios in which you would breach and others that you would stay within tolerance. It gets really interesting if you start to think about certain assets or processes that may impact several services, but I think that's probably a maturity point as you start to build this out. But it's something to bear in mind as you're looking at stress testing, which is stress testing a single service or stress testing something that will impact several services, is on your maturity plan as you look for implementation. And then, of course, is the ongoing governance. So that testing program, how you monitor and ongoing assurance around impact tolerances. Impact tolerances shouldn't be measured continually against the service. It's not the metric which you'll use every day, but it is used for that planning and informative way of what remediation your organisation will need to take. And of course, there is now this self-assessment. So across the top there, that self-assessment document that you'll provide back to the regulator. This is absolutely key in terms of getting all the right information into that. So we have these 5 steps and we speak to clients around these practical steps and try and bring them to life for them in terms of their business. And what we really found was that there are so many different examples that you could apply across different parts of financial services that it can tend to get quite muddled, and everyone wants a very, very specific example for their organisation, which is something that you will all have to work through. So as a firm, PwC decided to invest a significant amount of time and effort into developing a generic view that is an analogy that can translate right across financial services and beyond into what business services and impact tolerances are. This is a view that we have developed and have shared with the regulators on a regular basis as this has continued to evolve. And it does tend to get very good feedback with clients in terms of being able to take something that at least gets everyone on the same page with what these things are before you start to try and apply it more specifically into your firm. So we came up with the bridge analogy, and some of you will be familiar with this from our published papers. But we came up with the bridge, and very simply, the bridge is a business service. So crossing over the bridge, over a river, is a business service. And then you have the element of transactions. So as I spoke about, that baseline data, transactions, volumes, values, types of customers. That the transactions in this case is the flow of the vehicles across the bridge. There's a certain amount of capacity that that service will have. And again, this works neatly in terms of the lanes that you have available to you to allow those transactions or vehicles to flow across. And then the last 2 elements, of course, are the disruption. So what happens when you have to close lanes? The disruption to the bridge translates neatly into disruption of a service. And then what can actually be tolerated? So when a disruption happens, in terms of these vehicles crossing, what can be tolerated by the people that are trying to cross the bridge, not necessarily the bridge owner's tolerance, but the people crossing. So to get into some of the detail of this and really pull out that practical part of our title of the webinar, I'm going to ask Adam to take us through in some more detail across those 5 stages and how those 5 stages are used in the bridge analogy.
Thanks, Stella. And just to kind of reinforce the point, the reason why this works so well is because there's a picture here where you can tangibly see what is happening in this business service. Part of the challenge in financial services is trying to bring to life and get people excited about zeros and ones flowing through the air. Whereas particularly when you're trying to talk to senior management and the board, this becomes a very real scenario. And for anyone who looked 2 weeks ago at the news and saw the Severn Bridge shut because of high winds toppling a lorry, this actually is a real life scenario. So let's think about those 5 steps that Stella talked us through and just go through each one. So the first step then was around identifying and mapping the service. So we know that the service in this case is crossing the river, and the kind of level 1 maps are the highest articulation of how to deliver that service end to end are those 5 boxes. So a car, a lorry, some sort of vehicle approaches the barrier, the payment's requested, the driver pays, probably contactless nowadays, the barrier is raised, and ultimately the vehicle will carry on crossing the bridge. Now, I'd say second to impact tolerance, the question we get asked the most with clients at the moment relates to mapping. And that's really around, well, how much detail do you need to map? And really around a concern about how insurmountable the initial workload could be to do that, but also maintaining it. So let's not be under any pretense that these 5 steps would be enough to map this service. But what you could do is start to drill beneath this until you get to a layer that you can stop sort of mapping each of the resources underneath. So you need to look at where technology feeds in. You need to look at where people, facilities, information, and third parties feed in. And again, thinking about the bridge, there are tangible examples against each of them. So there's flow sensors or CCTV cameras that tracks vehicles crossing the bridge. You've got maintenance crew, probably contractors. You've got toll collectors. You've got the bridge itself as the primary facility, as well as any other premises where you've got control centres. You've got connections to number plate registration, so you understand what vehicles are crossing, payment card details. And of course, a bridge operator won't have all of these capabilities in-house. They'll be using third parties. So it's thinking about which of those are tapped into. So this is a prerequisite. Before you start thinking about impact tolerance, do you have a clear understanding of what your important business service is and a more detailed map of how you complete it? Then the next one, for anyone who remembers, was around gathering data. And this is an art, not a science. So Simon's made a couple of points already on this. He referred to Lyndon's quote that you have to be both a scientist and a poet. We talked about the challenge of is it qualitative, is it quantitative, and it's a combination of the two. So ultimately, you need to understand in words what impact a disruption to the service will have. It's no use saying, 100,000 people won't be able to do X. What impact does that have? If it's a payment service and you're trying to pay at a petrol station at 1 o'clock in the morning, what does it mean if you can't do that? So you really need to understand that, and the firms that we're seeing get further ahead in this are using customer feedback, complaints data. They're getting a rich view of what disruption means. But of course, the regulators have stated under their current proposals that you need a number. So this does boil down to having a quantified impact tolerance supported with qualitative explanations. So in this stage, you're thinking, what data points have we got that describe the day-to-day functioning? So down the left-hand side, you'll see some examples of measures that would describe a direct impact of disruption. So obvious things like number of vehicle crossings, the average journey time to complete a crossing, wait time, etc. But then there's also indirect measures. So, would you look at loss data because of fraudulent activity? Could you look at regulatory fines or even contractual fines with some of your third parties if you failed to deliver certain services? You might look at social media where you're getting into reputation. And then again, given the audience today, yes, this is around failure is inevitable and looking at a measurable impact. But the senior management or board would be crazy if they didn't want to understand what is the chance of a major event happening in the future. We want to make sure that our risk reporting is looking at that. So, could you look at historic trend data and maybe use that to anticipate certain weather conditions or times of the month where there's peak traffic? That means you're more likely to get an accident on a Friday afternoon, the last Friday of the month. Could you look at the average speed of vehicles? Because obviously if cars vans are starting to move 3, 4, 5 miles an hour faster, reaction speeds slow down, it's more likely that an incident would happen in the future. So it's balancing a view on how you measure impact, but it's also casting an eye to think what are some of your KRIs that you might want to deploy in your risk reporting later on. But I guess, sorry, Simon.
Just a couple of things to add to that. Experience today has shown that exposing that this activity is a really good way to expose some of that data through the organisation and to the board. Often the elephant in the boardroom is a lack of detailed understanding of how this works and actually how, particularly if you take, for example, a full service investment bank that has a lot of business services that operate in lots of different ways with lots of different territories, actually exposing how these services are working. I think we're seeing executives get really interested in, particularly when you expose that data visually, and that's something I think that has been a real benefit in how some people have approached this.
Yeah, and also, we're doing this for one business service in this example, but there will be data points that are common across many of your business services. So, work that you do in an initial pilot will be of use later on. So the left-hand side is to give you an idea of a bit of a long list of things that you could be gathering. The right-hand side is to say, well, actually, as a management team of this firm, we've shortlisted a few metrics because you need to be able to see the wood for the trees. And the ones that we're going to mainly focus on is looking at the volume of crossings and the average time. We're interested in the type of vehicles crossing, and we'll come back to why we want to differentiate that. And we also want to think about revenue, so we want to think about the financials. So stage 3 then is trying to draw these red lines, these maximum tolerable disruptions against your desired metrics. So we land on 2, and you have to work with our poetic license to say this bridge operator has 2 regulators. It has one that's interested in the impact on users of a disruption and one interested in the impact of the financial viability of the firm, given it's not a financial service firm. So in this case, we have harm to vulnerable consumers. Well, how might we focus on vulnerable consumers in this example? Well, because of technology and plumbing into, in this case, the DVLA database, we can look at the type of vehicles that are crossing the bridge, and we can isolate emergency service vehicles. Well, why are we going to do that? We're going to use that as a proxy to say any members of the public who are being served by fire, ambulance or police vehicles are more likely to be vulnerable, and actually a delay in that journey time will lead to an increased risk in this case of death or serious health issues, of fires not being put out, of urgent care not being delivered to people who are injured or wounded. So we decide to use an index which is a simple multiplication of number of journeys of emergency service vehicles times by the delay in the journey time. And you'll see from the kind of squiggly line on the left-hand chart But over time, this naturally increases, but it's not a linear case. This is hour by hour over a 24-hour period. Because of peaks and troughs in the flow of traffic, actually you'll see that there are bumps in how this increases. But this gives the firm a sense of actually what would the impact be over a 24-hour period. And on the right-hand side, we consider safety and soundness of the firm, so the financial viability. And we think about that through lost revenue as a proxy. And we'd also think about it in terms of penalties, which could be regulatory fines or contractual, legal fines. But in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be easier to focus on revenue, which is something you can track hour by hour, day by day. Fines tend to come after the event. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a chart that's not so lumpy. The downward line shows over a period of 35 days actually how much revenue is lost cumulatively. And by looking at this data, we as the management body of the firm decide to set the impact tolerance for vulnerable consumers to be 2 hours of total disruption, which assumes all 4 lanes of the bridge are shut, and that's an important word, and more than 50 hours of delayed emergency service journeys. And the reason why, going back to a previous slide, we don't think this is a case of saying you can have a simple single metric, which is 2 hours of disruption, is because that doesn't reflect the peaks and troughs intraday, and for other services it doesn't reflect it for day by day, week by week, month from month. So any incident you had blocking all 4 lanes at midnight would have a very different impact on emergency service vehicles crossing the bridge than at midday. So we want to make sure that that's captured. And on the right-hand side, we set the safety and soundness impact tolerance at being 32 days, so considerably longer, of total disruption and more than £30 million reduction in revenue. Realistically, you would expect there to be a difference between impact tolerances looking at the impact on consumers and looking at financial viability. In this particular example, it's quite stark. So that's step 3. So we've drawn a red line, and that's probably one of the hardest things to do, right? Because how do you decide it's 2 hours and not 1 hour or 3 hours or 4 hours? And there was some science behind this. So in this case, we've accessed publicly available government documents that talk about the type of emergency service vehicle journeys and what they're being used for. But ultimately, it is an art. So another firm could look at this and say, well, actually, we don't think it's 2 hours, we think it's 1.5 hours or 3 hours. And it's really down to the firm to be confident in saying why they have set it at how they've set it. But now we have these red lines, we need to test against them. What does that mean? It means looking at our contingency measures, our current contingency measures, to say, could we, for a set scenario, avoid breaching impact tolerance, or if we were to breach, could we recover quickly? So you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, imagine it was 7 o'clock in the morning, Monday the 20th of May 2019. The date's been chosen because it's a typical day. We wanted to choose a working day because the traffic flows are different on a working day, and we wanted to choose rush hour because actually it's important to know how you can handle the busiest time of day. The scenario is that 2 lorries collide, they pile up with 3 other cars, and ultimately all lanes of the bridge are blocked. There's structural damage to a wall. And to add an element of ambiguity, which is always interesting when you're doing any sort of testing, we've said that there's been a chemical leakage, and we're not sure at this point what that is. Why is it important to have ambiguity? Well, it just means that you can't initiate a cleanup crew to go and within 20 minutes say, oh, everything's back to running and it's normal. Actually, with some sort of ambiguity, there needs to be an investigation. You need to determine the right thing to do before you take action. And if you wanted to draw a parallel with financial services, this is when you could be looking at cyber attacks or anything around data integrity. And as the consultation paper calls out, the regulators don't expect firms to respond and recover a business service until they're confident that they're doing so in a safe manner. So that's setting the scenario on the left-hand side. What could a firm do? Well, This isn't an exhaustive list, but you'd expect that if it was the firm, let's assume the firm finds out itself about the crash first through monitoring CCTV, it would contact emergency service vehicles. It would close the toll gates remotely, so it would stop any more cars or vans getting onto the bridge. It would alert local media, so start diverting people who would normally use that as their journey to try and take alternative methods, again, to try and reduce the compounding effect of that impact. They might dispatch engineers to work with emergency services, arrange for lifting equipment. There's lots of different things that the firm could do. But will this have the desired effect? I mean, that's the ultimate question. So let's have a look at these measures against those charts on the previous slide. So if we look on the left-hand side, harm to vulnerable consumers, ultimately, yes. I mean, the contingency measures will relieve the pinch point on the disruption. But as you can see from the grey line, which shows the impact with the contingency measures deployed, it's not fast enough to stop a breach of impact tolerance. So, a 4-lane total outage in rush hour on that Monday morning means you would breach those 2 hours. So what would the firm consider as remedial options to try and improve that in the future? It might look at setting agreements in place with other third parties so they can charter a boat more quickly. It could look at other bridges further upstream in the river to work out whether there's arrangements around sending more traffic that way. But it's got to think about how it could respond in this incident in the future.
And just at that point, often the word substitutability comes up when we're talking to clients. And this is always the point at which I sort of pick it out, which is we get very focused on recovery again, and we sort of get sucked back into this terminology around what would we do to recover it, what actions would we take to mitigate once it's happened, which we do need to do. But then there is a fundamental feedback loop here as well, which is about if all 4 lanes are closed, you really need to question as well whether recovery on its own is enough, and actually go back to the design of the service and design of the delivery of that service. And actually, if it's about emergency vehicles in this case, and getting people potentially across to a hospital on the other side of the river, would you actually have an emergency clinic built on the other side of the river to ensure you didn't even have to get across the bridge in the first place? So going back to business models, key business decisions around how those services are delivered and designed may also and should be a consideration. Now, they are often bigger and more expensive, but that is also what I think the regulator is trying to get to, which is, yes, get those mitigating actions, but it should be informing those decisions, those investment decisions, not just in the mitigants, but in the actual business models. And that often crops up at this point, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, because the obvious reaction we get from this is someone saying, well, are you expecting us to build a second bridge? We can't afford to do that. And I don't think the regulators are expecting that sort of unaffordable investment, but they are expecting some bigger questions around, well, what could you do? What is possible?
I was with a client talking about an incident that they had just yesterday, and it was being discussed in the steering committee, and it was very interesting that someone in technology had said, well, this is exactly the sort of thing that you only identify when you have a problem. And I think there were a few people in the room thinking, well, no, this is exactly the sort of thing that you identify when you test. And if there's one thing that will be different post people's operational resilience endeavours, it will be the level of testing and the ability to at least have thought through what plan B is.
Yeah.
And as part of that, decided of the things that you won't do, as you say, as well as things that you will.
Well, and that point about it flushes these things out. So of course, it's a huge benefit simply to have identified that in this sort of scenario you can't meet your impact tolerance. I'm not saying the regulators would allow you then to do nothing about it, but you've already improved your firm's readiness for thinking about this. On the right-hand side, just because the firm manages to recover so quickly, this doesn't start to touch safety and soundness. So the conversation they would have with the regulator looking at financial viability would be a different one. I can see already from the Q&A coming in that we've got questions around dual impact tolerances, but I suggest we'll come back to those shortly. So just cracking on. Stage 5, the last one was around ongoing governance. So the main image on this slide is starting to think about what a one-pager view of resilience of a business service could look like. You need to specify what your impact tolerance is. That's the top left. Top right would give you a sense of what scenarios have you tested so far and how have you been able to maintain service availability within or outside of impact tolerance. You'd want to plumb in the box underneath, looking at your strength of resources. And beneath that, you gather incident data. So this is just an idea about how you could summarise the resilience of a service. What we haven't captured here, and that's the first bullet on the right-hand side, is the importance of the self-assessment document. And assuming that gets baked into the final policy, that is the end product that your firm will need to go, the relevant person will need to go to the regulator to explain and defend. So yeah, on the next slide, you'll see, what do you have to include in the self-assessment? List of important business services, corresponding impact tolerances, approach to mapping. This comes back to Simon's point. It's around showing your workings. It's not enough to just say, here are important services, here are impact tolerances, thanks, we're done. No, they're interested in what's your methodology, how have you gone about it, and ultimately, what are you doing to address identified vulnerabilities? So, what does this look like in practice? We can't spend all of our lives talking about bridges. This is a means to an end. But for anyone who has studied the consultation papers in detail, there are lots of examples in there of business services. So on this slide, we give a few of them: mortgage disbursement, money transfer, insurance contracts. And what we do in our white paper is give a little bit more information on 3 of them. So we've chosen a banking, an asset management one, and a life insurance one. And again, you're thinking, what's the level 1 process? What's the level 1 service end to end with those different processes, and how far do you want to drill to explain all of that? One thing I would say, to come back to Stella's substitutability point, you'll notice that the examples we've given on the left-hand side are channel agnostic. And this is one point that I don't think the industry's landed on an agreed view yet. So there are lots of examples out there where people are talking about, online banking this and telephone banking that. I think from our experience, being agnostic of channel helps you as a firm to consider, well, what are all the options available to that customer before we start thinking about any other remediation we want to do. So the obvious example would be the second bullet, so accessing deposits and savings versus accessing cash through an ATM. Well, just because your ATM network might be down, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, your customers could be using other firms' ATMs. They could go into a branch to withdraw money. They could go into a post office. There are lots of other things available to those customers which might lessen the impact on them of being unable to use an ATM if it was to be narrowly defined. So maybe this is a good point to tap in, Stella, to kind of some of the feedback that we've received in the conversations that we've had on this topic.
Yes, I think so. We spend a lot of time, as you might imagine, talking with clients right across financial services, all sectors, actually sharing ideas, sharing points of view. And there are quite a few common themes that come out around the consultation papers. So actually, there are topics there where we all agree that they're confusing potentially, as opposed to agree what they are. So in terms of impact tolerance, actually, I think probably has the least consensus. So we can talk impact tolerance right across the sector, and you find pockets of agreement, but still the approaches, the importance of them, where they fit in this sort of sequencing, seems to differ. So I think that's one thing, and clients really are looking to the regulator still for further guidance, which may or may not come, but there is something there, and the industry groups that are up and running will help to draw some of that together. I'm going to jump through a couple of them. I think the importance of considering end user feedback, a lot of firms are now starting to wake up to this, which is they're starting to lift their head, look outside of their own organisation. We are very used to navel-gazing and actually thinking about our own firm, and more now are realising that to understand the impact on an end user, they're going to have to talk to some of those end users. And even though that activity may not have got underway, I think it's now on the list of considerations for many firms. The setting of tolerance around business service versus tolerance by scenario is an interesting question. You need to have multiple scenarios to see where you would breach or not breach, but actually there is a question out there, which is, should you actually be setting tolerances by scenario for a service? I think that probably is adding a level of complexity that may be unnecessary, and we start to get into the science realm, but it's an interesting challenge. And then at this point, actually, we also have the challenge of the dual regulated firms. So I know we've got some questions on that, so it may be a point that we discuss now, and then we can just tie off this after that.
So for those firms out there who are dual regulated, hopefully you are aware of the current proposal, which is you would have an impact tolerance that you would discuss with the FCA and an impact tolerance that you discuss with the PRA. And at face value, that seems a bit over the top. But I think when you try and understand the rationale behind it, it does make sense, even though it makes it more complex. So your discussion with the FCA, based on their consultation paper, is that they are interested in two main things, right? So harm to consumers and harm to market integrity. They reference an interest in the financial viability, because let's not forget they are the largest, if not one of the largest prudential regulators in the world. But for those firms, they are smaller than the PRA one. So they're focused on consumers and market integrity. That's very different to the PRA and the Bank of England that are looking at threat to safety and soundness, threat to financial stability. And as we saw with the bridge example, when you consider consumer impact versus the impact on the firm itself, they are vastly different. Now, I think it'll be interesting to see where the regulators land on it. I suspect they're not going to change from their views, but what it does mean is that firms have to have a choice to make. And that choice is around, do they just focus on testing against the lowest of them, the lowest common denominator, which in many instances would be consumer harm, or do they test against both? The PRA have been very clear in their consultation paper that wherever firms land, they will challenge them to make sure that the scenarios are sufficiently robust to stray into safety and soundness and stability concerns. So, I think whether you're allowed to set just one as a dual regulated firm when the final rules come out, you're still going to be pushed to show, is your testing proportionate to historic incidents and hypothetical ones. And that links with the second question maybe we'll just cover. So we've had two people ask, how extreme does the test need to be? I'd say pretty extreme. So when people have asked us in the past around what's the difference between operational resilience scenario testing and business continuity testing, the answer tends to be, it's got a bigger focus on the stakeholders, on customers, and it's probably going to be more extreme. So one firm, for example, used to test one of their buildings becoming unavailable, and under operational resilience testing, they've moved to say, well, actually, it's a citywide outage, and that means our backup site is now unavailable. And that might seem a bit more in the severe and less in the plausible scenario, but you only have to see what's happened in Hong Kong to understand some of the citywide issues you can have. And of course, Milan at the moment with the coronavirus. And for anyone who joined the Infoline conference we did in November, we saw a great video around a European city that saw a power outage across the city. So these things do happen. We know of one of the regulators who've tested, I believe it was a 90-day outage of the Indian subcontinent, which was, I think, the most extreme we've heard of. And there it's really saying, all your BPO outsourcers have gone down for an extended period. What would that mean? So regulators are thinking about extreme, but I think as a firm, you need to start off with one and then just work out how much more you need to develop, how more plausible, how more severe does it need to be.
I think the reason that we're doing this testing is to identify vulnerabilities, isn't it? So we've got to remember that there is big testing, small testing, frequent testing. Again, I think probably a year ago we did a transatlantic roundtable with US and UK clients, and someone remarked, "Oh my goodness, are you telling us that we'll be testing every day?" And again, it was interesting. We knew there was some people in the room thinking, "Well, yeah, pretty much actually. We're going to be testing all the time." People now talk about Chaos Monkey and other sorts of technology to imitate switching things off and switching things on. We've done some interesting work recently where we've started to model this and built what we call the digital twin for operational resilience. And when we exercise that, it becomes really quite interesting. Then you can model switching servers off, in a heartbeat, right? It doesn't have to be a kind of big set piece. So there's kind of interesting tension here between people thinking big, extreme, severe yet plausible versus, once we've got this data, we can be really agile around testing things out day in, day out. So we're quite excited about what people can do with data and modelling techniques with that.
And I think just as we move on, this was titled Industry Feedback so far, and we're very conscious that the PwC voice, whilst strong and we're proud of that actually what's very beneficial often is to hear from your peers and other organisations. So one thing that we have done is convene a small group of clients on this topic, and we will be publishing a brief paper, the result of that, and that includes investment banking, retail banking and a global insurer. So you won't just have to listen to us, but you can hear from your peers.
Do you want to answer a question?
I do. Before you go on to your next slide, just because one's coming and it's just timely. So what would a reasonable population of scenarios to test impact tolerances look like? I like the language chosen in the consultation paper, which talks about variations on scenarios. So I think if it was me, I'd be developing one initially for the business service that I was going to test, but I would look at tweaking around the edges. So in this case, we've done it for Monday the 29th of May at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well, what would it look like if it was, Saturday afternoon when there was a football match on, or if it was the Christmas Eve, right, and change different weather conditions. So I would be thinking around playing on the variations initially, and then to Stella's point, actually, as you get more mature, I'd think more carefully around a scenario that could hit multiple services and use, technology like the digital twin Simon just talked about to understand how a single disruption could affect multiple parts of your business, because that's where it starts to become really insightful.
The other thing we frequently say is use the day-to-day incidents that you experience as a firm. Yeah. So actually, I was in a operational resilience steering committee last week, and it was interesting that the firm had experienced quite a major incident, and as ever, we were going through the post-incident review, but the firm hadn't yet thought about writing that post-incident review in the language of impact tolerance. Right. And actually, you could start to see there that we can, even though we sometimes haven't fully mapped their business services, you can start to say, well, let's use that real incident that we had, and to your point, tweak. What if that happened on a different day? What if it was twice as bad, etc., etc. So there's some simple things to do that can be very effective. I'll bring it back to what will be our final slide, and then we'll also pick up some other questions if we have time, which is this slide about second line of defence. So again, I would say remember why we're doing this. Back to the 3 points, and remember that you can identify your vulnerabilities. Your clients can identify your vulnerabilities. Or the regulators can identify your vulnerabilities. The choice is yours. So what would the second line role be? Well, as ever, the second line is really important to challenge and test. And of course, the second line role, particularly in larger firms, is idiosyncratic to the firm. And there will be a culture and behaviour and a way of working. We firmly believe that the work that needs to be done here is in the first line of the organisation. The people who are running the technology operations or the operational technology and running the business, and that's reinforced by kind of the regulatory dialogue. The second line needs to prove and needs to support that. We're suggesting that on the basis that if impact tolerances are the standards of operational resilience, then the second line is a good place to own the methodology of those standards and tolerances. But this really doesn't work in our experience where you have second line functions second guessing the operations of the business to try and develop business services and impact tolerances. It is the first line, it's the people operating the business, and then the second line is able to check, challenge, prove, maybe assess against the self-assessment statements that we talked about, etc. And defining how those impact tolerance, statements and standards fit in with other aspects of the risk management framework. I think it is really important to develop your language in your firm for this topic. There isn't a dictionary, and it's not being developed for you. So get the language right. Focus on making sure that you are able to explain that narrative to the executive and non-executive board, and then they will be able to understand how this does and does not link to risk appetite and other risk reporting. Of course, there's other assurance activities, and I think the other piece that we often say that we haven't touched on today, but I think is well received, is if you look at your existing board reporting, take a look through that existing board reporting and think operational resilience as you look through. What are you doing already that's being reported to the board that is actually the business taking decisions around operational resilience? Of course, the second line is also going to play a really important role in the methodology for the scenario testing, and of course making sure that this is sufficiently adventurous in terms of testing, and that the organisation can support testing that doesn't always have a happy ending. So the kind of another perhaps failing of business continuity version 1.0 was that big set piece testing with everybody very well prepared and a happy ending, doesn't always develop a great deal of learning. But we're not so naive to suggest that in a sophisticated firm, lots of kind of ad hoc failures can also, just persist in the organisation. And as ever, I think educating the business and being clear about where the second line wants to play in this, and also is not playing, is really important. The final piece I'll add to that is around communications. I think particularly if we go back to the bridge analogy, what we've identified as we've sort of role played it through in scenarios is you can already see that if you've done all of that work in relation to your bridge, in the time of crisis, if you're the person standing at the front of the bridge, you can start to talk to your clients, counterparties, customers about the work that you've done to develop this and about the planning that you've undertaken. And that enables your communications to those clients, counterparties and customers to be far more sophisticated. We're going to look to see if there are any other final questions. Adam, is there anything else coming in?
So there's just one other one that's coming around end user and customers. So the language in the consultation papers moved on from talking about customers from the discussion paper, which I think a lot of people felt was very retail focused. And they now talk about a business service being something that you provide to your end user or participant. And we know that on the one hand, that's been helpful for some of the wholesale firms in understanding it's not just about retail customers. On the flip side, people don't always know how far to stop. And if you're providing services to corporate or institutional clients, how much of that do you read through into a different user? So I don't think there's a set answer to it. We do include that as one of the key topics in the publication that Stella's mentioned that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. And we get some industry views there around what others are doing on the topic.
So let's finish back on slide 3. I think if there's a slide to finish on, at least just visually. Let's go back to that, because that's what this is all about. Prioritise, identify what's important, set those standards, think about developing good standards, and then invest.
Thank you. Adam, if you'd like to draw the webinar to a close.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to thank you for tuning in to this Risk Minds webinar. It will be available on demand within the next 24 hours. So I'd just like to thank everyone from PwC for their time, and thanks for tuning in.